One of the fantastic things about Responsible Business Forum is that we have these work groups that are all about deciding next steps and action and where we go after this meeting. So the conversation doesn't stop in this room. So just for those who perhaps have not been involved in the work groups, just to let you know, they cover 6 sectors: agriculture and forestry, palm oil, consumer goods, financial services, building and urban infrastructure, and energy. And basically in these groups, recommendations have been put together for next steps, and these will be taken to policy or business context to see where they can go forward. So we're going to hear from the chairs of each of those working groups on these specific recommendations. So Ken, you chaired the palm oil work group. So could we start with you and hear what recommendations came from your discussions?
Sure. We had a very spirited discussion. We started with our panel and then broke into 5 working groups and had each working group report out, and then I've done my best to assemble the recommendations. And we have basically 4 recommendations with a few issues that we highlight under each one. The first recommendation is that we need to increase the available information, both in terms of quality and quantity. So this means that we need to have more transparency in terms of understanding what the palm oil companies are doing. We need to work on traceability of the palm oil through the supply chain. We need to do a better job with mapping and rationalizing the mapping system so that when the government is monitoring and mapping actions back to owners, we have a consistent system that allows us to do that. And we need to work on our real-time monitoring of burning, develop at the other end of the supply chain, we need to develop better customer awareness with an emphasis on helping customers understand when they are and are not using sustainable palm oil. That's complicated because the palm oil itself goes into so very many different products. And we need to do a better job communicating about the successes in the industry to let people know that progress is being made even as the pressure continues to make progress. So the first point then is increasing available information. The second point is developing incentives for sustainable plantations and developing those incentives from different directions. Governments can do a better job incentivizing and supporting sustainable palm oil. Financial institutions could set up benchmarks for financing and encouraging sustainable investments. And we need to find a way to differentiate. This goes back to the first point. We need to find a way to differentiate among the products so that customers will be willing to pay a premium on sustainable products. But that, in turn, needs to be supported by government policy. So one of the areas in which we currently get premiums on oil, on sustainable palm oil, is from Europe for fuel, where it's mandated you must have this. So the second point then is to develop incentives for sustainable plantations and production. The third point is develop the role of the small players, and in particular the smallholders. Smallholders make up 40 to 50%. They're currently 40, moving toward 50% of the supply of palm oil, and so we need to pay attention to that. Because they're smaller, they have different hurdles than the larger companies, particularly when it comes to information, skill sets, the equipment that's required for sustainable palm oil, and so on. So we need to find a way to support the smallholders, and we also need to be able to monitor the smallholders and differentiate them from others who they may border with, in particular when it comes to burning. Oftentimes we blame the smallholders. Sometimes it's not the smallholders, it's their neighbors, but they get blamed. And we need to support them with better monitoring. And then finally, the fourth point then is that we need to avoid counterproductive government intervention. There's many things we agreed that the government needs to do. And some of those are rather obvious. I've referred to a couple of them already. But we also need to avoid counterproductive government steps. And so, for example, when RSPO requires its members to preserve certain kinds of land, those members complying with RSPO may find the government taking the concession back for the very reason that they didn't convert it. And so this is a point at which RSPO standards and the government may be working in opposite directions, and we need to work with the government to resolve that. Another example has to do with the fact that there's multiple standards. And so a company that's already certified under RSPO may then have to go ahead and be certified under the Indonesian sustainable palm oil standard. Even though the RSPO dominates the ISPO in terms of its requirements, it's a whole nother set of compliance process costs. And so rather than requiring companies to do both of those, there are ways in which the government could reduce the overall cost of the certification process.
Ken, thank you so much for that. You had a very detailed conversation in your group and very systemic set of solutions. So thank you. That was Ken Richards, Professor of Sustainability at National University of Singapore. And now I'd like to move on to the Consumer Goods Group. And this is Cara Hurst, who's the CEO at the Sustainability Consortium. So Cara, I know I was in the session and this is a very interesting discussion. Can you tell us?
It was a great room full of really passionate advocates for the consumer goods sector. And one of the things we sort of said right up front is consumer goods is a very wide umbrella that incorporates a lot of different industries. So we had representation from information communications technology companies, also from clothing, footwear, apparel industry, food, beverage, agriculture, home and personal care products, paper, pulp, and forestry. So you can imagine that the issues were quite diverse, and I think the conversation went in many, many good directions. We identified probably on the order of 20 different interventions that could be taken and recommendations for the Natural Capital Forum and for TEEB. So what I've tried to do here is to summarize a few of those themes that came out rather than go through them one by one. But we have lots of good notes, and I think lots of more discussion to come. So one of the things, just building on that cross-industry piece, was the need to really collaborate across industries and share some of those best practices and successes that are working. But I think in that, the conversation centered around the need to really embrace the conflict in some of these issues, the conflict that's inherent in some of these discussions, and I think not shy away from that. There's a lot of good conversation about what makes collaboration actually work, and the fact that you need to kind of draw that out, to bring it out, and there are some inherent conflicts even between the industries in terms of their prioritization. So addressing those, identifying those areas, and kind of welcoming that kind of discussion and debate into the conversation was identified. I think that the second one I would say is that the conversation be inclusive of a very diverse set of stakeholders that really ranged from indigenous peoples groups and farmers and fishermen, people who are currently maybe not in this room or included in the conversation to date, but making a point to include the diverse set of stakeholders and people who are really affected and participatory in the conversation, and make sure that the language that we're using around natural capital is inclusive and communicative to different audiences. We had a good conversation about the need to speak in business language, to have businesses hear and understand what we're talking about, particularly coming out of the previous panel on accounting, but also to be able to translate that to folks who are in the field or who may come from different industries and have a different language. And there was a good conversation about whether or not we need one language that speaks to kind of all those different types of communities, or whether we need to be able to speak in different types of languages about this issue. But I think it's a good point to break down some of the barriers to the conversation on natural capital that currently exist. We talked a lot about the life cycle of consumer products, and going back to Linnell's conversation on design, sort of incorporating the design and designing out our consumption of natural resources in some of these consumer products. So design to production and manufacturing, all the way through sale and consumer use, consumption, and end of life. And a lot of the conversation in one of the groups focused on that end of life or end of use of consumer products, and really where there could be incentives created around waste, where the government could play a role in creating incentives and disincentives to create an economic market for some of the end-of-life issues that exist in consumer products. We also had a very good conversation around consumers themselves and what role they play in the sector. To bring up maybe one of the points of conflict, I think the consumer products industry or group was more or less in agreement that consumers will not pay a premium for these types of products, and that we need to figure out ways to incentivize them or to communicate in different ways along these types of issues and all the way, again, through the product life cycle. There was some conversation about consumers driving these issues from the bottom up, but also that you wouldn't let corporations or corporates off the hook for their responsibility for these products. And the move that we're seeing now in many of the industries from production economy to a service economy, so that maybe the company never relinquishes ownership of that product, that they maintain ownership of the product and the consumer rents or has a different relationship with the product. And so what impact that has on the natural capital conversation. So I think another couple pieces, and then I'll wrap up, but one, that the valuation of natural capital does not drive a race to the bottom, that putting sort of the monetization conversation we had earlier in that valuing natural capital does not mean that there's sort of a fast and furious race to the bottom where people with the most assets then drive to consume that capital. And how do we prevent that, yet value it as a business might need? The fact that this needs to be a global conversation, encompass all regions, developed and developing countries having different issues in this conversation, but also that it's not just Asia or the East that needs to change, the West needs to change, our consumption needs to change, and it needs to be, again, a very inclusive conversation. And I think the last point I'll make is around the complexity of this conversation. So the complexity that's inherent in the conversation. If there's a way that we can embrace that complexity and to recognize it, but then not create a system which is complex. So really embrace the complexity, but drive towards simplicity. Come out of this with a very simple and low-cost solution for the companies that they can embrace.
Thank you so much, Cara. Some fantastic suggestions that would apply to a lot of businesses here from that session. So if we move on now to the agriculture and forestry, chairing this session was Peter Holmgren. Peter's the Director General at the Center for International Forestry Research, C4. So Peter, can you give us a summary of the outcomes?
Yes, thank you. We also had a very interesting and intensive discussion, and I've tried to cluster the 10 recommendations into 4, so we'll see if that works. The first one is about integrating existing solutions across the sectors and across the landscape, both for policy and markets, because the feeling was that there are a lot of solutions out there, but they are scattered, and there might be a lot to gain if we try to work across these solutions. And related to that, also that there needs to be, coming back to the simplicity question, there needs to be ways to measure sustainability performance that are applicable more generally. So that's the first cluster. The second cluster has to do more with the producers or the farmers. And there was one very interesting recommendation to ensure sustainable human capital. And I think that's something we should clearly not forget about here. And that has to, of course, to do with farming communities, education, empowerment, enrichment, entrepreneurship, training schools, etc. There are enormous needs in this field, and of course we can't expect to go too far down the sustainability path without having the producers with us. And they are, of course, as the second part of this recommendation, they're of course at the center of the decision making. And that the livelihood and income of the farmers has to be at the center of attention when we discuss sustainability. The third cluster is a bit more complex. It has to do with finance in a few different ways. One is to incorporate natural capital in the credit risk models and analysis. I think this is the main theme of the conference. And thereby enable banks to engage and work with corporate clients in maybe new ways. Related to this, that there is a need for public-private partnerships in the finance sector, and also NGOs to work together to manage risks and enable investments in smallholder farms, which also needs appropriate regulation. And also related to the investment side of things, agribusinesses, I guess that means larger agribusinesses than smallholder farmers, which are also agribusinesses, but anyway, to focus on and invest in the resilience of food systems, and that there is a feeling of a need to look a bit more long-term and a bit more in-depth in the food system as part of their value chain. And finally, on the investment side of things, to invent financial models that help farmers avoid unsustainable practices which may sometimes be made because capital is not available at the right time of the season. And the fires were mentioned as one example. The fourth cluster, I think, is really interesting. And it came from one of the tables. And in short, it is about saying that maybe it's time to separate the agriculture issues from food security. With the logic that, and I'm adding a little bit of my own thoughts because I've encountered this discussion sometimes before, in a way, agriculture has operated under the cover of food security and haven't really had to bother with other environmental impact. We see that very clearly in the climate change negotiations. Agriculture is never taken on board for food security reasons. But agriculture can never solve food security. Food security has completely different reasons. So maybe, of course, functioning and sufficient and effective agriculture is necessary for food security, but it's not sufficient. So maybe it is a good idea that we should separate the agriculture issues from food security in our debates.
Okay. That could be a disruption in terms of that kind of thinking in the sector. And you can see the crossover in some of the issues you brought up and some of the issues, Ken, from your side on the palm oil. So if I pass over now to the financial services group, and I'd like to introduce you to Jeanne Stampe. Jeanne is the Asia Finance and Commodities Specialist with WWF International, based here in Singapore. Jeanne, can you talk us through the recommendations from your group?
Sure. We came up with 5 recommendations, and the first of our recommendations is that governments can lead by example ahead of and in addition to regulation. So for example, sovereign wealth funds could require their investment professionals to undergo training in natural capital related matters. Sovereign wealth funds, as well as other asset managers, so asset owners, can include references to ESG and natural capital in their mandates to hire fund managers. So that's our first recommendation. On the second one, we felt that the insurance industry has potentially a lot to contribute to this whole movement. They could, when calculating risk premiums, especially for business interruption insurance, factor in natural capital related risks and mitigating actions, because after all, the insurance industry specializes in using information to calculate financial impacts and probabilities of risky events. Our third recommendation focuses on the banks, where we felt that for banks who are performing well in terms of banks requiring their clients to adhere to certification standards such as RSP or FSC, there should be some mechanism to recognize that certain banks are performing in advance of their peers, and greater transparency and also peer-to-peer sharing, especially within Asia Pacific, to help stimulate greater discussion and to move the Asia Pacific banking sector forward and a bit closer to some of the competitors in Europe, for example. Our fourth recommendation is that accounting firms should use their very close relationships with CFOs to drive home the message on natural capital. So it's not just the partners sitting in the sustainability teams, but also reaching out to their tax and audit partners who hold the closest relationships with companies and across different levels in the companies to send a message to and to help to raise awareness and provide education there. And then lastly, we felt there was a strong role for rating agencies to strengthen the emphasis that natural capital plays in their rating assessment process, which would send very strong signaling effect with regard to corporate sustainability performance. So these were the key 5 recommendations, and as a general note, we felt that whilst the financial sector has a crucial role to play, having governments measure national growth and development just using one layer, one standard metric of monetary terms today without valuing natural capital results in a disjoint where you have governments looking at growth in one way and then the financial sector using a different currency. So there needs to be a concurrent move towards valuing and incorporating natural capital.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeanne. And moving on now to energy, we have Yves de Boer. Yves is the Managing Director, Sustainability and Strategy, Southeast Asia, in Accenture, and also based here in Singapore.
Thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to figure out which sequence we would take. But yeah, no, I'm good. Let me give you our quick energy heads up. I probably first need to set the stage because whereas so many of the 6 items are actually industries, with energy, it's not that much energy as an industry the way we looked at it, but much more energy as a theme. So we're all energy consumers, businesses are energy consumers. There were a lot of sort of organizations involved that provide solutions to help reduce energy consumption, increase energy efficiency, etc. So we took energy as a theme rather than energy as an industry. So I need to state that first. With that in mind, 2 questions we aim to tackle. One is, how can we increase the rate of energy efficiency? And the second one, how can we increase the adoption of low carbon technologies and increase the carbon efficiency in the energy mix? So those 2 key questions. And 4 recommendations that we synthesized down to. The first one was there is a need to create awareness at all levels, at all stakeholders. The second one was to create an inclusive and enabling environment for all these stakeholders. The third one was for regulators to firmly and decisively step in. And the fourth one was all about showcasing and expanding successes to date. I think something that has been mentioned a couple of times before as well. So let me zoom into each of these 4 elements a little bit further. And when I do that, let me also highlight to you some of the transversal themes that actually cut straight through each of these 4 elements. Because there are a couple of dynamics that basically kept coming back from the various tables that we had these discussions. One was you can't manage what you can't measure. And that's actually one of the things that is at the very basis of some of the recommendations that came up at the high level and at the detailed level. Another one was to create sort of peer pressure and use competitive forces and things like gamification to actually help bring about behavioral change. And these things will basically pop out when I further flesh into these four recommendations. So, awareness on all levels for all stakeholders. What does that really mean? It means that you need to enable stakeholders to make informed decisions on what to do. Which actions will lead to what outcomes in terms of better carbon efficiency, better energy efficiency, but not just to predict that, but also to close the loop and make visible to those same stakeholders what the results are of their actions, which is usually a very motivating cycle. And if you can get into that cycle of continuous improvement, goodness will happen. So, awareness and transparency at all levels for all stakeholders. The second is about creating an inclusive environment and an enabling environment for all these stakeholders. So, which is really about, to some extent, unleashing the power of the masses, or some other refer to it as the bottom of the pyramid, There are a lot of examples, and whether that's within organizations and businesses, by the way, or whether that is in society, it can be in all these different groups. But if one way or another you can unleash this enthusiasm from the base of the pyramid, a lot of good things will happen. Whether it is a contest within a company for the best energy efficiency idea, and the winner of the contest is the employee of the month, right? Or whether it is a specific neighborhood jointly investing using crowdfunding mechanisms into a solar power plant on the rooftop of their HDB or a condo, or some community building, or sort of jointly investing in a windmill. There's all sorts of positive effects that you bring about in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of awareness, in terms of really feeling the ownership of this particular venture, that this will actually enable. The third one is for regulators to step in. I was not surprised, but I think it was striking to see the decisiveness of the various table discussions about the need for government to step in. And step in a way that creates clarity for businesses, so to allow them to make investment decisions with confidence, which is one of the main reasons why businesses want regulators to step in addition to the other reason, which is to create a level playing field. And this is actually very much in line with, I think, one of the things that we recently again reiterated in the research that we did with the United Nations Global Compact, where we interviewed and surveyed about 1,000 CEOs, and they're very clear as well that they're not afraid of government and regulators to step in. They want them to step in, because a not level playing field is a big issue that needs to be overcome. And by the way, it's also interesting to see the dynamics play out then, because what you'll see is that those businesses keen to differentiate and be ahead of competition, they will not wait for government to step in with regulations. They will want to be ahead of the regulators so that they have a competitive edge as and when those regulations actually kick in over those that waited for regulators to step in. So that was the third one. The fourth one, showcasing and expanding successful projects. I think it's been mentioned a couple of times before. It's also one of these what we call the 7 steps of sustainability leadership within this same UNGC CEO report. It's really about leadership. It's really about leaders in specific industries or in specific themes and initiatives to showcase the goodness of what they've been doing, to be inspirational, and basically to help and infuse all that goodness to their peers. And this is something, by the way, that not just businesses can do. It's also something, and it was actually one of the civil service participants in the room who mentioned that even governments can use this sharing goodness and sharing best practices as a way to incentivize leaders in a specific industry, in a specific geography, to step up their game, because they may be picked out by government and showcased and brought to the rest of the world to tell about what good they've done. So that's as for the energy theme. So awareness at all levels, create an inclusive and enabling environment for all those stakeholders. Regulators, don't hesitate to step in, create a level playing field, and showcase and share all the goodness that is being done out there.
Thank you so much. And a lot of common themes starting to come out now, you can see across the groups. So we have one final set of recommendations. This is for the Building and Urban Infrastructure Group. And I'd like to introduce Jessica Cheam. Jessica is the founder and editor of Eco Business here in Singapore. Jessica, please talk us through the recommendations.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. We had a very stimulating discussion for the building and urban infrastructure. And in fact, we had 10 recommendations and had to take a vote for the top 5. Just to set some context, there is a wave of urbanization sweeping the globe, and cities are emerging as the economic engines of the future. They consume a large amount of resources and of course have a huge impact on natural capital and also the well-being of citizens. So our recommendations focused on what the public, private and people sectors can do to create resource-efficient and sustainable cities. So for the first recommendation, it was for the public sector to take stronger leadership. And I think the leadership role in governments across Asia vary, dramatically from country to country, from Singapore to Indonesia, Malaysia to Thailand. So the 4 things that came under this was, 1, adopting a whole of government approach to building and infrastructure projects. There was some acknowledgement that government agencies were operating in silos and they needed to speak to each other more. Mandating green buildings, this was considered a no-brainer by many people in our group. Providing industry data for transparency, such as energy data, so that businesses and governments can make better decisions. Implementing a carbon tax ahead of a global deal, because we've seen how hopeless things are at Warsaw. And to channel the funds from this carbon tax into urban sustainability projects. The second recommendation was for the public and private sector to collaborate and set up pre-project innovation committees for all major public and private building and infrastructure projects to enable integrated design. So the philosophy is enabling all stakeholders involved in any project to come together and actually talk about the project before it is implemented, so as to reduce mistakes and the use of natural resources. And the third recommendation is for the public, private and private sector and civil society to promote green consumerism and behavior through public-private sector partnerships and education and competitive pressure. For example, giving a public comparison of electricity bills between residential blocks, between commercial buildings, so that building owners and residents actually feel the pressure to perform better than their neighbor. I think this works very well. And our fourth recommendation was for all public and private sector organizations to commit to a builder's responsibility code of conduct. I think people felt very strongly about this because, like in the retail sector, they have a retail code of conduct. For the building sector, this would be to consider the full life cycle of materials in construction and infrastructure projects, and to ensure that any material from construction is channeled back into the system. So if there's any demolition waste or any construction waste, that is all fed into the system and reused so that there's no waste. Our fifth recommendation was for the private, public and people sectors to work together to bring nature and ecosystems back into the urban environment, and to consider natural capital accounting in making decisions on building and infrastructure projects. And if you can squeak a sixth one in, because many people felt very strongly about this, was actually for the role of financial institutions and banks to play a bigger role in providing loans and funds for energy services companies to conduct audits and retrofits to improve sustainability and energy efficiency. There was some feedback that local banks in Asia are very slow in this area and unfamiliar and unwilling to give funds. So I think this is a tremendous area for improvement in terms of financial institutions operating in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And what I'm hearing across so many of these groups are a number of suggestions for voluntary initiatives for business that are about pushing the boundaries beyond where we are now, but also a lot of calls for action in the government space to also do what government can do best in terms of regulation and get the political will to do that. And also hearing a lot of calls for public-private partnerships, collaborations that can be best to solve some of these sustainability challenges. So thank you all so much for that. I'd like to particularly thank the chairs here that have presented the recommendations, but also all of you who participated in these working groups. It's a great opportunity to get some really innovative thinking and then bring it into a forum where we can now take it out to other forums and do something about it. So please join me in thanking the chairs of the work group.